Hi, welcome to blackcoffeepoet.com. I'm Jorge Antonio Vallejos. This is our first interview, and I'm here with Deb Singh of the Toronto Rape Crisis Center. This week is the week of December 6th, and women of color are left out of the discourse, and that's why I'm here talking to Deb about what we can do, how we can bring awareness to that, and how women of color experience violence differently and are treated differently than women who are not of color. So, Deb, please tell us who you are, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Jorge. My name is Deb Singh. I work at the Toronto Rape Crisis Center, Multicultural Women Against Rape. I'm an activist and counselor here, and I also identify as a woman of color who's queer in the community.
Awesome. Deb, please tell us what you do here at the Rape Crisis Center.
Well, we provide many services as a collective, as a survivor-led organization that works for the empowerment of survivors who come into our center. We offer counseling, accompaniment, face-to-face counseling. We have a 24-hour crisis line that you can access at 416-597-8808. We offer different programs for women, art therapy groups. We actually particularly have a mask-making workshop that's happening at the center for Black women and women of color only right now. So it's great that we're having this conversation.
Awesome. So today is December 6th, and December 6th is the day to honor women who suffered violence. But it started because 20 white women were murdered in Montreal. And all these years since it started, women like my mother who are of color, women like you, and other women of color and Aboriginal women have been left out of the discourse. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, when I think about December 6th, it's obviously really important to honor the women who died and why they were killed. They were killed by someone who was anti-feminist. The women were killed purposely because they were women who were breaking what they call the academic glass ceiling, I guess, in terms of going into a male-dominated field like engineering. At the same time, the first thing I think of is all the missing Indigenous women over the last, you could say 400 years, you could say 20. So oftentimes when I think about December 6th, I think about also honoring Indigenous women who've been lost to us and to this movement and to this world. So it's, when I think about women of color being left out of the not just the discourse, but even just the activism or celebration, I also think about the fact that there are so many women of color organizers out there and so many people doing the work. At the same time, it's about that mainstream media place or that mainstream way of thinking around violence against women. When it happens, the survivor should be ashamed of herself. She should feel bad. She's usually, the perfect little survivor, so she looks a certain way, she's a certain age, it was definitely done by a stranger, and all these different pieces that we think about in terms of sort of like a mainstream way of thinking about survivorship. So then you think, well, the survivor should be going to the cops for accountability, right? And as we know, in women of color, people of color communities, like those places, like the legal system or government systems also perpetuate a systemic level of violence when interpersonal violence happens in our lives, right? And then when you think about it from a cultural standpoint, of course, it's really important to think about certain ways of doing things in order to stop violence or for men to be accountable for violence aren't gonna work in every culture in the same way, right? So I think when we think about women of color being left out, it's also like saying that we're doing a ton of work out there, and so that's not seen in a certain way. And then because we're doing it sort of like against the system, so we don't always tell women, especially from the center context, call the cops, right? We think it's really important for women to feel like they're empowered in the situation, and oftentimes a lot of people don't feel empowered by calling the cops. So it's important that we use our different tools, whether they're cultural, radical, as women of color, to support survivors of violence in that way.
Okay. What can you advise to the organizers of December 6th and the larger Canadian society that December 6th is not just about the white women, it's about all women, transgendered, of color, Aboriginal, white?
Well, I'm going to do a workshop and on December 6th, and we are going to talk about, obviously, what happened that day, the Montreal Massacre, Polytechnique, the school, and the reasons why it's happening. But those reasons still transpire to this day, right? It's not just 20 years ago now 21 years ago, that this happened. It's also about how patriarchy is still manipulating women's lives and creating, and violence is in fact the tool of patriarchy to keep women out of their places, right? So I think it's also really important when we talk about December 6th that we memorialize many different women, and also talk about the impact of women of color in that context. Women of color are more likely to experience violence. Women with disabilities are more likely to experience violence. Indigenous women are more likely to experience violence than white women in these contexts, right? So when we think about this, we also have to think about who we're trying to reach and why. And so, and also the value of women's lives. You know, I think simply and clearly, certain people's lives are more valued than others. And so we don't want to highlight certain violence in certain communities, even from a race perspective, because we don't want to say this happens in our community. At the same time, white people don't necessarily value the lives of Aboriginal women, Indigenous women, when we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of women being killed, you know?
Totally. So how can viewers of blackcoffeepoet.com help out?
Well, there's a number of ways to do it. I think one of the easiest ways is when we're talking about December 6th is to memorize, memorialize, and talk about out loud supporting all the different activist communities who are doing this work. I think especially radical women of color are doing work to not just honor or see December 6th as this thing that happened to Canada, but rather this point of beginning. This is a place where it's so clear that this violence happened, and yet Indigenous women are dying every day. There are lots of very clear places where this violence has happened as well, right? But it's not as well known. So to talk about those things, to talk about those in those communities. Also to talk about those very statistics that I mentioned, you know, like women with disabilities are 5 times more likely to be experiencing violence in certain ways, right? So talking about how identity does impact our experiences of violence. And then also accountability, like how can we stop violence? How can we stop perpetuating a violent culture, right? And one of the simplest things is recognizing when sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism is happening to us, right? Happening around us, happening through the media, and then talking about it.
Absolutely. Is there anything that we've left out?
I don't think so. I think we did great.
Great. Read Bell Hooks, read Chrystos, read Maracle, and please tune into blackcoffeepoet.com this week as we've got Shanga Tagore, a Bengali poet, queer poet from Toronto, who's written The Erasable Woman, and Janet Romero, a queer Latina woman, is reviewing it, interviewing Shanga Tagore, and then on the Friday we've got different women of color reading poetry around violence against women of color and Aboriginal women. Thank you very much for tuning into blackcoffeepoet.com. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Jorge.
And please stay with us in future.